Hello and welcome back, everybody, to Psychedelics today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from an undisclosed location. I am I'm on the road, and I'll be at the Meet Delic conference Saturday and Sunday, and the following couple days I'll be in Miami for another conference. So and that's why we had to do some different stuff for today's episode. So no Solidarity Friday as normal with Kyle and I today. We do have a very special guest today. We have Rachel Yehuda, PhD, professor of psychiatry and neuroscience at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Really incredible person and massive contributor to the PTSD research space. Yeah, Rachel will actually be a keynote speaker at Wonderland in Miami, which is going to be pretty cool. And we'd love to congratulate Rachel on being awarded an endowed chair by the Mount Sinai School of Medicine last week. Endowed chairs are pretty awesome. So I'm really happy that Rachel has this, and very excited to see what goes on there. It's going to be really, really cool to see what can get produced in Rachel's work, since Rachel is tied in with the VA in the United States, and is definitely a leading expert on PTSD globally, and has contributed a ton there. So she's actively doing psychedelic work, research, and we get into some really great stuff in this podcast. So Rachel and I had the chance to connect briefly on this panel for I think it was the SciTech Summit a while back, and Rachel was part of this panel I was moderating along with Rick Doblin, Robin Carhart-Harris, and Matt Johnson. So really cool to get to talk to Rachel a little bit there. And we didn't really get Rachel enough airtime, so we wanted to revisit and get her some more airtime. So I think people need to definitely hear from Rachel more. So please stay tuned and pay attention to Rachel. Follow her on Twitter. We'll have links in our show notes and much more. And I think that's it for right now. If you want to see Rachel in Miami on Monday, Tuesday, you can get a ticket using the code Psychedelics today at microdose.buzz to save 20%. And we'd love to see you there. Kyle, David, and I from the team will be there in Miami, and say hi if you see us. Again, microdose.buzz, code Psychedelics today, and we will see you there. All right, everybody, that's enough for this intro, and we will see you on the other side. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today, we are joined by Rachel Yehuda, a psychologist and neuroscientist at Mount Sinai in the VA, and a professor of psychiatry and neuroscience at the Mount Sinai School. Rachel, is that right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
thank you.
Outstanding. Yeah, thank you for joining us, Rachel. This is really exciting. I've been aware of your work for maybe a little over a year now, and I just thought you were too high-end to want to come on our podcast. So I'm really just honored you're here and really excited to dig in.
Well, thanks for asking me.
Yeah, you got it. So we bumped into each other. Unfortunately, we had some tech issues on that recent SciTech Summit, and I think that's how I scored your email. So I'm really psyched on that. And that was really fun, but it would have been a lot more fun if we didn't have those tech issues. And, it's tech happens, tech issues happen, especially in our fun pandemic age. But, the topic there was around kind of where business and research intersect. And since you didn't have too much opportunity to speak there, was there anything you kind of wanted to comment on before we kind of jump into profile you a little bit?
No, not specifically. I thought that it was a really meaningful conversation, and I think that it is important for industry and academia to be engaged in a dialogue. But I think what I would have wanted to say is that it's more than just industry and researchers and academics. There are a lot of people that should be around the table as we have discussions in the psychedelic space. So really, there's a need to be very inclusive because so many people are coming to this from so many different perspectives.
Right. So not exclusively chemists, doctors, and business people? Who else might you like to see at the table?
Well, I'd like to hear from people that might want to use psychedelic medicines for their healing, and from people who have also been using them in various forms, both in terms of cultural and indigenous, religious and spiritual usage, as well as people who have participated in trials in the more medicalized model that we now have. So I think that there are a lot of people that we want to hear from. I get several emails a day from people that have so much hope about what these potential therapies might do to improve their lives. And so I think we want to hear from everyone. I also think we want to hear from people that are a little scared of these medicines, to hear why they're scared, what their trepidations are, and what we can do to be sensitive and aware of issues that we might not have thought about.
I really appreciate that. And that's, there's a lot of room for improvement here. A big portion of Psychedelics Today's work is this interdisciplinary approach. So you get to hear not only from deadheads, but underground guides and people working at various trial sites, indigenous voices as well, when we can find the ones willing to speak. So I think you're spot on, and I really appreciate you saying that.
Great, thanks.
I've been in conversation with a number of past trial participants, and we actually podcasted them. The researchers haven't yelled at me yet, so I feel okay about it for now. But it's been interesting to hear about what the protocol was like for them, and what they really liked, what they thought could have been improved. Their kind of compassion for the lack of resources to make the research more like a perfect therapy.
Yes.
It's there's always going to be kind of a lack when we want to research stuff like this. Yeah.
Yes.
Just like the lack of integration, I guess not lack of, just not enough of, or at least processing support from therapists, I think was primarily the main thing. And maybe connecting folks with a group.
Yeah, it's frustrating to be in a research protocol because it ends abruptly, right? When you establish a clinical relationship with someone, I would imagine that in the future, the therapist and the patient will agree to do psychedelic work as part of a longer term therapy after they've gotten a chance to know each other very well and agree on the issues, and then can really spend a long time after the psychedelic journey talking about it and really weaving in other kinds of approaches and maybe going back if there's a need to do that. But this is true of all research protocols, not just in the psychedelic space. There's kind of an arbitrary beginning, and there's an arbitrary end, and it's standardized. And a lot of times people wish they had known. Sometimes you refer people that you've been working with for a long time to a research study. Sometimes the person that calls is someone new that you've never met before. And so you're at very different places with potential research participants. And then afterwards, sometimes you have the opportunity to continue in a therapeutic context after the trial, and sometimes you don't. So, these are vastly different experiences. And somehow we have to learn from that moment where we start and we stop the clock.
That's a big deal. Do you ever have to have those conversations with participants? This is research. This is not therapy. Like, this isn't an approved protocol, so it's slightly different from how we might deliver something in a later stage.
You have to have those conversations. Yeah. Part of doing the research is to have that conversation where in the informed consent visit or in the screening even, you really have to reflect on the fact that this is a research protocol. And so the clinicians, the study therapists aren't free to just do anything that they might do if it weren't a research protocol. And when you're involved in a research protocol, you may not be certain what treatment you're going to be getting if it's a randomized clinical trial. And a lot of the things we wish we could say to patients who are participating in trials about how a treatment works, we may not know yet fully because we haven't done the research. So, yes, what I think I like to emphasize is how grateful I am that somebody's willing to take the risk to be a participant in a trial. Often that risk is weighed against the fact that there might not be a different way, or certainly not a legal way, to access the treatment. So it's a kind of situation where there's a lot of give and take, but people who participate in trials really are giving something to the world, not just themselves, because it is a big unknown going in. It's always an unknown when you start therapy, what the outcome will be. But in a research study, the goal is to find information so that somebody's clinical experience down the road after a treatment is approved or found to be worthy of clinical use can go a lot smoother.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. I I knew some people that actually quit being part of the research team at one of these organizations, largely because they felt so much guilt around not being able to deliver something in a research capacity that, their perspective was that it was life-saving, and they weren't able to give it to everybody. So they were like dealing with these study participants and getting really upset when they would get the placebo or not be admitted. And I get it, right? Like I think that's kind of common in the psychedelic space to kind of feel upset. But any thoughts on that? Like people just dropping out?
Well, yeah, I think I think it's very hard when you think a therapy is a really good idea for someone to maintain this neutral stance. We're actually trying to study whether this is a good therapeutic approach. So, researchers sometimes design their own trials and their own treatments. I've done that. We've had
Mm,
trials that were conducted here where the intervention was my idea based on work that I had done, and I was really rooting for the therapy. But
mm,
usually those trials underperform compared to my expectation or wish for them. And it's
yeah.
very important for people to go in very neutrally in a research capacity so that we can get the information that we need. One of the things that we've learned about mental health treatments is that there's almost no treatment that absolutely everybody is going to respond to. There are
Right.
individual differences, and it's very important going in to have an eye out for the question of who would be best suited for this treatment and who is not suited for the treatment. Now, unfortunately, the statistical approaches that we use just compare the active treatment group to the placebo group or the other
Mm,
condition. And that statistical approach doesn't necessarily allow for a fine grained analysis of who are the responders and who are the non responders. But in clinical practice, somebody has to actually think about whether the person sitting in front of them is going to be a good candidate for a specific treatment. So the more neutral we can be about collecting that information in clinical trials, the better off we're going to be in the long run when we try to apply the knowledge in clinical practice. And this idea that we need to have statistical significance for a treatment to be adopted, that's absolutely true. But most treatments that are approved really don't work for everyone, or they might work a lot for a small number of patients and improve many patients a little, right? Or some
mm,
patients
mhm.
won't improve. Or there will be half the group that really, really responds well, but you're still left wondering who are the others that didn't respond as well. So there's a whole science that really should be developed. And we've been actively involved in this for about 15 years. Just the
Mm,
science of trying to predict who will respond to various treatments and to try to be able to use objective biologic markers in addition to clinical symptom ratings to understand whether and to what extent recovery has really been achieved.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And like it's clear just hearing you speak about it. Like there's a lot of hope here, and it's really important that we do this work. But it's just a lot of work that we have to get through before we have this level of certainty that we want.
Yeah, what you can promise someone in a research study is that you're going to do your very best to support them through the process and that you're all about helping them get through the trial. And if for some reason the trial, their clinical outcome doesn't improve as much as everyone hopes it will,
Mm.
that you'll help them after the trial also mobilize the resources that they're going to need. I think that somebody who takes it upon themselves to be a participant in a study trial deserves that, and that investigators should be providing that. So just this idea that you're really going to be there and do everything you possibly can to make sure that if this treatment doesn't work, the person will be able to access something that will work for them.
Mm. Right. Okay. So we've made it pretty far downstream. Now I want to rewind and try to talk about you,
Okay.
if you're okay with that. So what got you interested in psychology and neuroscience generally? And then how did psychedelics kind of show up there?
Well, I was interested in psychology and neuroscience more generally for at least 30 years before I even thought about psychedelics,
Mm.
at least. So I've been interested in how the brain works for a long time. I've been really interested in the way stress changes us and the way it impacts us. And this idea that we do respond to very similar challenges in such different ways. And some people really seem to thrive in adversity, while others really seem to be very vulnerable to the negative effects of a stressor. So this intrigued me from day one. Also, the idea that stress hormones, when they're released under conditions of stress, really send a lot of messages to the brain. So that
Mm.
it's not necessarily that the brain is regulating the release of hormones from your adrenals and other target organs, which it, of course, is doing, but that there seems to be a crosstalk, that there seems to be a feedback mechanism where the reaction that you have is actually being communicated. You're actually communicating your reaction to the brain, and that this kind of communication is really helping you go forward. And the idea that the way that you respond to stress at time one may really influence the way you're going to respond to it at time two and going forward.
Mm.
So I thought that that was really fascinating, and that there are probably very interesting brain mechanisms of plasticity that would really help understand that there were mechanisms of brain plasticity that would really help explain these differences. But if we understood those mechanisms, then maybe we could really optimize responses for people and help people not only overcome adversity, but thrive in the face of adversity. And so
Mm.
all of those were the things that I was very interested in before I heard about psychedelics.
Mm. Okay. And did you know you really wanted to go this kind of clinical route to dig in?
Well, I was always kind of hovering between, do I want to study basic mechanisms in doing animal research or clinical practice? And so I started in my career really more as a kind of classic neuroscience animal researcher. And over time, I realized that I was much more interested in people and the clinical aspects. I'm actually very interested in the science, but I didn't love the part of working with animals so much. I talk about
Hmm.
this a lot. I've talked about this a lot in other podcasts. I really didn't enjoy killing animals and those aspects of research that were just very hard for me to physically do, even though I loved very much kind of the clarity of information that you do get from classic neuroscience. So when you start to do work in people, you don't have access to their brains in the same way. You can't ask the same kind of questions. Their tissue to look at, but they talk to you. So you have less good biologic things to measure. But when you really think about the fact that you can ask people questions and then kind of relate that to some brain processes or proxies for brain processes, that might make up for it. But I think both kinds of work are very, very important. And I'm glad that I've had the opportunity to do all those kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it adds a nice contrast. When you do one kind of work, you can reflect back on the other and vice versa.
Yeah, that's 100% true.
Yeah. And now, how did psychedelics come on your radar? Did Rick Doblin call you up to try to talk you into looking at it, or?
No, not at all. How did psychedelics come up? I first heard about psychedelics from really a good friend of mine who was asked to be an early sponsor of one of the MAPS trials. And so I actually traveled to Israel to see one of their study sites. And I really found it curious, the idea that somebody would get better after just one session, which was what people were saying at the time. And I couldn't quite wrap my head around it. Then, interestingly, my son told me about a psychedelic experience that he had had. And what he was trying to convey to me was how important the experience was, and how, as he said to me, more himself as he tried psilocybin than he had ever been, which honestly, as a mother, first concerned me a great deal. But then I thought, well, wait a minute, if it's being used in clinical trials and I'm hearing this, really made me open to hearing more information. But weighed against that was that, as you obviously know, the neuroscience research that was happening just, 10, 15 years ago, even 5 years ago, was really indicting psychedelics as neurotoxic agents. So on the one hand, you have people saying, well, wait a minute, there's something really important here. You have this other group of people saying, but these drugs are dangerous, not to mention the scheduling. But what finally, I think, did it for me was that I started attending Burning Man a few years ago. And I did finally meet Rick Doblin there. And, if you've been to Burning Man, you have to be very open to a lot of new ideas, and to say the least. Yep. And I think that somehow the narrative that these drugs are dangerous became less and less compelling. And the idea that these drugs are potentially very, very important, not only in the capacity of a mental health condition, but the people that were telling me about how psychedelics changed their lives weren't necessarily people that had mental health diagnoses, but more problems that we all experience, like trauma and loss and things like that. And so on the balance of it, it seemed that there was more there on the side of maybe there's something important here. And Rick Doblin, actually, I do credit him for why I am interested in psychedelics, although my husband says I should credit him because he took me to Burning Man. So I guess both of those things are true.
It's an argument there.
There absolutely is. And of course, my son is the one that really mentioned this to me first. But what Rick Doblin did was invite me to a MAPS training to be a therapist. And at first, I had really no intention of being a psychedelic therapist. But after I did the training, I was so blown away by 7 days of really teaching and viewing videos, and just the combination of the people, Michael and Annie Midhofer. Rick Doblin was there. These were the days when we did things in person before COVID. I'm very grateful for that. And
Yeah.
after the training, Rick asked me, well, what do you think? And I said, I think that this would be a great thing to do for veterans at a VA. And he said, well, good luck with that. I would definitely be interested in supporting you. And I, I thought, I think the time has come. I think, especially since MDMA, which was the subject of the training that I went to, was being studied for PTSD. And MDMA is a pretty gentle psychedelic compared to other psychedelic experiences. And we don't really have a lot of robust treatments for PTSD that really are what I would like to call game changers for people. The treatments that we have do reduce symptoms. People are definitely better off having the state-of-the-art treatments than not being treated at all. That's definitely the case. But many people get distressed when they have to talk about traumatic experiences and have to confront them not in an altered state of consciousness. Many people are so avoidant of the material that they drop out of therapy. And sometimes taking a chronic medicine like an antidepressant can make people feel that they're just too numb to emotionally engage in anything, which is a form of avoidance in itself, but possibly one that can help with some symptoms like sleep or things like that. So it's this idea that we really don't have too many other kinds of approaches. But what I liked about this approach was that I understood it. I understood what the purpose was of taking the MDMA in the context of confronting traumatic material. I totally understood that this was what we needed to be doing with patients who have extreme trauma and PTSD, that this is what we try very hard to do with patients with PTSD, to try to get them relaxed enough, but not too relaxed, kind of in a good window of tolerance where they can engage with traumatic material with openness and insight and introspection, but not be too terrorized or distressed by the actual traumatic memory. And so it felt to me like this was exactly right. And when you do the training and then go back and look at the results of the clinical trials, and then go back and look at the literature about the harmful effects of psychedelics, you get a very different perspective. And I was able to contextualize the literature that might have talked me out of psychedelics, and probably for years and decades have been talking mainstream psychiatry out of psychedelics, by making a very clear distinction between perhaps negative effects of psychedelics when they're used in the context of drug abuse, or used in the context of a lot of people taking a lot of drugs not in a proper way, versus a therapeutic regimen, where with the intention of really exploration, as opposed to just being numb or feeling good in your body without really trying to explore more than that. So this led to a very powerful idea for me, which is, based on this concept of set and setting, which is that what can explain therapeutic action goes above and beyond the straight pharmacology of a certain compound. And this is something I have been suspecting for years, as I see so many individual differences in the way that our medicines work, that may be based on the fact that we're so different from one another, so that the same medicine may have different effects on different people. But it's more than that. It's the idea of an intention, which I think is certainly true for psychedelics, but it may be true more broadly too, that the idea of really healing and the work that somebody wants to put into healing may have a different outcome than really the passive ingestion of something that someone tells you is going to change your neurochemistry. And so I found that a really profound idea, and perhaps the most profound idea in the psychedelic renaissance, because I think it's really empowering. It's really using the medicine as a tool, but not relying solely on a pill for healing and insight. You still have to actually do the work of learning something, of having an insight, of beginning the process of introspection and really talking about what those insights under a psychedelic journey mean. So to me, it really harkened to a time in psychiatry where people were analyzing things in a more deeply comprehensive way, but it was taking too long. And there wasn't really a structured approach to it. Psychoanalysis was deeply criticized because it almost seemed like you were inventing a new treatment for every patient. Not that that's a bad thing, but it was very hard to kind of study it or learn from it or understand it.
Or scale it.
Or scale it. But with psychedelics, you kind of have the best of that process. Plus, you have an accelerated phenomenon. You do have a science. You do have the ability to manualize a treatment to some extent to kind of understand a dose and the conditions under which a medicine is taken. So, yeah, all of those things got me very excited and enthusiastic. And so a few years ago, I I told my team, we're doing this. I think this is something that we should do. And I expected resistance. I got almost none. People were just really interested in learning more. And now we've trained 30 therapists. We're on the cusp of beginning to trials, probably in the next month or two, enroll our first subjects. And it took a lot of work, of course, to prepare for doing clinical trials, especially since we're going to be doing a lot of biomarker work in connection with those trials. And we're also going to be doing translational neuroscience to learn more about these medicines. But, the day is here and everybody couldn't be more pumped to see how it goes.
Great. So is this one of the first projects inside of a VA system? Is it a clinical trial or part of an existing trial?
I think it is the first randomized clinical trial of PTSD, but I think that there are others in the process. I think there have maybe some trials in other indications, but yeah, I don't think that it's something that happens a lot or hasn't happened a lot lately. But I think it's because I think it takes a lot of time, and it's quite the procedure to get things lined up so that you have the proper approvals from the sponsor, from the FDA, from the IRBs. I mean, there are a lot of steps to go through in getting any clinical trial launched, but certainly one with a substance that is scheduled. So I think you're going to be seeing a lot more of these clinical trials in academic settings and in conservative settings, because I think a lot of people are very interested in seeing how these compounds work and how these treatment approaches work. So I think it's becoming something that people who a few years ago, like myself, would have not really considered as part of kind of for lack of better words, a sober academic approach to a clinical problem. I think people are open to it. I think that, again, back to the beginning of our conversation about, therapists that leave clinical trials because they have to give someone a placebo or they just can't do what they might otherwise do. I think that's actually a benefit of doing clinical trials in a conservative academic environment. I think we want to be able to trust the information. And if somebody performs a study and is not a true believer, to me, that would make a gigantic impact. That somebody that I know and trust from other circles, someone who has a track record of both saying some stuff works and other stuff doesn't, I mean, those are people that we want to participate in the psychedelic renaissance. So I think one of the myths that goes back to the round table also is we don't need everybody around the table to be gung-ho psychedelic aficionados. We want the
Right.
medicine to speak for itself in clinical trials, and we want to pay very careful attention to people that don't respond the way the zeitgeist is telling us that everybody will, because we want to learn from everybody. And I use the word optimize a lot. I think that that's our challenge. How do we take the tools we have and the medicines we have and really figure out for whom they are a good fit? That's always been the challenge. Drug companies want to market drugs, so they'll say, use this drug for this indication. But clinicians apply more nuance than that. It's not
Right.
just the indication. It's what is your life like? What is your environment? Who are your supports? What are the other things that are happening? How expensive is this going to be? And are you going to be able to afford it? So there are a series of really practical psychological and sociologic considerations. There are clinical considerations. What is your physical status like? What is your emotional status like? If you have PTSD, what else do you have? Do you also have, if you're a veteran, a mild traumatic brain injury? Do you also have depression? Do you also have substance abuse? So it's not just about what label you carry. It's really about who you are as a person and what environment you are going to be in, both in the therapeutic context and outside of the therapeutic context. Where are you going home to? And will you be able to really have the best gains possible based on who you are and what's happening with you? So all of these things have to be considered.
Right. No, I'm glad. Like the VA is such a big organization. And I think you're spot on here that the data needs so much rigor that it can't be argued against. Right. And that's what folks are working towards, to have it included in the pharmacopoeia and list of treatments. Right. And it's probably a really weird treatment when clinicians look at it to say, wait, what you want to do? Like, oh, this looks very different from ECT.
The
Like,
first
why would we
time
do
that the
this?
first time that anyone is exposed to the idea, I mean, you have to say, "What?" This isn't part of your normal experience. If you,
Mm,
most of the people I know, I would say, really, the great majority of people that I know will maybe have experimented with psychedelics if they were, in college during the 60s or 70s a few times. But people that I know who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s in a more mainstream clinical medical environment are more cautious. Don't forget, if you're in a clinical environment, you've seen the downside of drug abuse. You have seen what it looks like to be addicted to
mhm.
certain compounds. We haven't been very good about making distinctions between patients who try psychedelics for self-actualization versus patients that get hooked on opiates or heroin because they want to numb the pain, or patients that are, risk takers or sensation seekers or any one of those things. So the information that clinicians get about substance abuse really portrays what happens when it goes wrong, when people get addicted, when they take too much of something or they take it in combination with other things and they combine it with kind of having a lot of interpersonal problems or not being able to function very well at work or at home or interpersonally. So, the challenge here is, again, to introduce the education of how certain compounds can be used therapeutically. But there's also a lot of skepticism. A decade ago, many doctors were absolutely convinced that opiates, when used clinically in a therapeutic context, would really, really be helpful for the majority of their patients that had extreme pain. And we know that that did not end well. So again, we want to go into all of these new developments with our eyes wide open and with a very sober assessment of potential risks. But we don't want to stop ourselves from vetting new treatments, from developing new treatments. And we don't want to be afraid of what I think many people are afraid of, which is an altered state of consciousness. I think that for people that have never really experienced this remains a scary frontier. And, most academic clinicians have not had psychedelic experiences. So we're sort of asking them to learn about a treatment that involves being in an altered state without really having them understand what that altered state involves. And so it's going to be a very interesting thing to see how we introduce education about psychedelic psychotherapy into more traditional settings. So, I think it's really important. And certainly that's what I would like to be a big part of. But when I do speak to more mainstream people, there are fears and a lot of misperceptions. People think you won't have any control over your thoughts. That's not true. People think you won't have any control over the things that come out of your mouth. That's not true. People think that it will act like a truth serum and that you will disclose something that you will be horrified that someone else knows. That's not how it works at all. So the only way to really know that with certainty is to have an experience where you understand that you had an opportunity to open up, but you could have opened up in any number of ways, but that you felt more inclined to be trusting and that you felt more inclined to view what you were seeing as a gift, a vision, something that you would want to embrace, even if it's hard, or it would have been really impossible to think about embracing that truth in a more normal context. So, these are all really interesting challenges for the mainstream. So, in that conversation about academia and industry, this is more than just a new drug for a new disease. This is a whole different philosophy of healing. This is a whole different philosophy of education and really getting people to understand. And as I've discussed with Rick Dobler many times, part of teaching and training and learning about psychedelic psychotherapy involves unlearning a lot of things that you've learned in a more traditional way. So it's going to be a big lift. But think about where we were just 2 years ago and think about how excited so many people are. So I think the psychedelic renaissance is coming. I'm speaking at very conservative venues, and people most of all are intrigued and hopeful and less scared than ever before. So I think that people like you who are involved in psychedelic education are doing a heroic job just really creating the proper venues for curious people to get more information.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. It's a big deal. And yeah, the more people we have out there literate in the research and theory, the better, I think. Especially if we want to move the needle here. I have a friend who's inside the VA as an employee, clinician of sorts, and vague just to protect her identity. But she attended one of your talks and on PTSD and I think MDMA for PTSD. Did you ever
Did I ever talk about that before?
inside the VA,
yes,
like grand rounds or something?
Yes, yeah. I have. Yes.
Cool.
Increasingly.
So good. This is a couple of years ago, I think, before the pandemic, and she's trying to, have this conversation after you left. It was getting shut down like crazy by, colleagues and superiors inside the VA. And I was wondering if there's like any kind of advice you would give to somebody inside the VA or another conservative institution to try to at least have the conversation, not necessarily try to make the clinical trials happen, but colleagues should be able to discuss research, right? Ongoing research.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think in all settings, you're going to find people that respond to new information and new approaches with this idea of that's not how we do it. If you're interested in setting up research in any organization, you should go to your research office and learn how to, if you don't know, write a research protocol and just go through the steps. You don't have to have a lot of discussion and buy-in at an early stage. What you have to do is have a protocol and have it reviewed in your research office and see how the institutional review board responds to what you're doing. And then if they don't see any risks or danger, then you can start having the conversations. That's the order I would do it in, and say, hey, I have this protocol. I'm excited about it. The IRB reviewed it. I'd like to take the next steps. And there are many next steps for which, the institution would need to really be behind me. But I think the thing that people are most concerned about in conservative settings, I won't name any specifically, is, will this be safe? Will this be safe for our patients? And all research involves what we call a risk-benefit ratio. But the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB, they're the ones charged with making these determinations on behalf of an institution. And they're going to ask tough questions like, how are you going to keep this patient safe? What are you going to do in the case of this adverse event? They're going to want to see what kind of evaluation the person's going to have. They're going to want to know which people you're going to allow in and which people you won't allow in. They're called inclusion-exclusion criteria.
Yeah.
What if somebody's already being treated with something? What are you going to tell them? So if you go through the process of applying to your local IRB, that is a great way to begin any conversation in any institution, because the IRB is charged with asking, and they ask it for every protocol. It's not specific to psychedelics. They want to know how you're going to deal with any research that involves risk, how you're going to be keeping the participants safe, and how you're going to be ensuring their autonomy to make a real choice about their participation and what happens when they no longer want to participate. And if you start there and just treat it like any other study and just go through the steps, what you'll find about psychedelic research is there are just a lot more steps. But the initial steps are the same. You start with a protocol and a lot of discussions about who your population is, what you're going to do, how you're going to do it safely. You write a consent form, and you go from there. So I think the idea of having these conversations and being shut down because they're academic conversations, start with the protocol, start in a very concrete way, and let's have a discussion around this particular protocol and not a theory more largely. Do you know what I mean? So that would be my
That's interesting because
approach.
it gets them to engage in the conversation about the research and doing research as opposed to
be specific.
Right.
Yeah. And then of course, the IRB won't let you do a project until ultimately there's a lot of signing off by a lot of people for a lot of very good reasons. But the first thing people who are a little reluctant the first thing they're going to want to know is, well, what did the IRB think? And the IRB might say, well, we're okay with it if, X, Y, and Z. And then that's when you'll be able to, a lot of logistic things, who's going to pay for it, a lot of practical things. Where are you going to store the drug? Who's going to give you the drug? Who's going to approve it? How are you going to get a DEA license? You'll work through the steps. But again, I find that if you want to do something really big, you start out with something really small and concrete and just kind of work your way up through the chain of it, through the process of it.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you for that.
It's very unglamorous to do it that way.
Right. And you think you could have these like honest, open conversations with folks, but it's
You can.
it's a trick.
You
Mhm.
can, and you will. I think there's also this idea of, the first conversation is a no, and then maybe the third conversation is a maybe. So I think that, look, the first time I heard about psychedelics, I was polite about it, but I thought, how could this be a good idea, really? I I thought that.
Yeah,
I will
it
not
makes
lie.
sense.
I really
Yeah.
did think that. But I'm glad I had many opportunities to revisit the question until I understood that, wait a minute, if I have these questions, I can be part of the solution of getting the answers. And I'm a perfect person to try to do that because I understand what the limitations would, I understand what the concerns would be because I'm in that world and I'm a card carrying member of that world. And I spend a lot of time wondering if certain things are safe or if they're good ideas to do. I've served on IRBs for probably all in almost 2 decades in various times
Yeah.
in my life. So, you develop a mentality that the science has to be really good. You have to justify the risk and the procedures have to be there. And it's not a philosophical debate. And then eventually, people will be more attuned to it. Then they'll see an article about it and they'll say, oh, that's that conversation I was having with that psychologist. Well, maybe it's not so flaky. Maybe it's not so crazy. They'll see a little blip on the news. So just because the first conversation doesn't work, it doesn't mean the subsequent conversations won't work. So if you put enough drops of water on a rock, pretty soon you can make a very nice groove in stone from water. But you have to
That
keep
is a
those
great point.
drops, keep those drops coming.
Yeah, be like the water. I
Yeah.
like it. So, next up, you mentioned Israel, and there is
Yes.
some recent stuff happening there in regards to psychedelic research and some sort of Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation project. Did you
Yes.
follow up on that, or do you know
Oh,
anything about
yes,
this
yes.
study?
I heard about it I actually went to training with the people that were doing the study and they were in the
Awesome.
training and I got to meet all of them and really talk to them quite a lot. They were very interested in kind of the intergenerational and epigenetic aspects of the work that they might be doing. So, yeah, no, I think Anton Lior and Natalie Ginsburg, I think this is a really interested group. At the time, I think they were,
Natalie was involved. That's really cool.
yeah, very cool. I think they were initially going to study MDMA, but it then kind of took several iterations. I believe that they're doing ayahuasca now.
I
But
think so.
look,
Yeah.
what an idea, right?
Right.
So I wish them the best of luck and I can't wait to hear all about it. But just this idea that you might have a tool that might make people who wouldn't otherwise be willing to engage or who are willing to engage but don't really know how to make make it effective sit down and share something. It's beautiful. We actually had Natalie give a talk at our mindset lecture series and what she described about how people were opening up and putting themselves in each other's shoes really brought tears to my eyes. It's a beautiful application of psychedelics, and it's a very interesting study as far as I'm concerned.
Have you yeah. All right. So yeah, so we've neuroscience itself is pretty young too, right? So we've got to develop this whole field quite extensively, especially as it relates to psychedelics, if we're interested in this being medicalized
Right,
at scale,
right.
right? So yeah, like what are you interested in the next few years for neuroscience? Like, do you think there's going to be some really interesting new developments in the space?
Yes, and thank you for asking that question. And thanks also for saying that you understand the importance of doing the neuroscience for adoption into, kind of mainstream academic medicine
Mm,
because, academic medicine prides itself on trying to learn if they don't know how things work and why things work. And it provides an enormous sense of comfort to prescribers to have some idea of how a treatment works. Now, I think we need deep humility here. that we are not going to know or understand how psychedelics work in the brain for a long time, mostly because I think the tools that we need haven't necessarily been developed. And one of the exciting opportunities is to develop those tools. And I know that we're very interested in doing that. What we do know so far is that just understanding the pharmacology of a compound isn't going to get us where we need to go. So, although we might know things about what serotonin receptors a particular medicine works on, or things like that, we don't necessarily know why taking a compound that acts at those sites occasions almost a mystical, for some, definitely a mystical experience or an altered state of consciousness that then provides a vehicle for introspection and insight and healing. So we'll never know that from pharmacology, but we might be able to develop ways of looking at the opening of critical period plasticity. We might be able to use computational neuroscience to explore natural language processing, which is really a neuroscience analysis of changes in language before and after psychedelics. We may be able to use brain imaging in very novel ways and explore the brain regions that we think are implicated when you just give a psychedelic and just stand back and see what lights up. What happens when we recruit those networks in doing tasks while under psychedelics, or even well after a psychedelic experience. So we may also learn more about the relevant neurochemistry and epigenetic mechanisms that are involved in sustaining specifically the kind of healing that occurs when you have had a psychedelic experience. So there is so much to be excited about. There are novel methods in neuroscience now that allow us to look at individual neurons that are regrown from stem cells from specific donors. I mean, we are just limited now by our imagination. The kind of video game cognitive neuroscience strategies that can be brought to really exploring, changes in the brain. And it's more, it will be an understanding of networks. It will be an understanding of the neurochemistry, the neurogenomics, as well as the pharmacology that will really get us where we need to go. What's exciting is that we're going to have to develop it, and we're going to have to really understand what we can and cannot get from animal models. So I think that psychedelics offer us an opportunity to learn more about the brain than we've been able to learn thus far, which is just exciting, even outside of its ability in therapeutics, right? So a lot of people can be interested in psychedelics for a lot of reasons, but this is a time where we're going to see a lot of innovation in not only drug development, but also in ways of understanding what those drugs do. And so if you're a young neuroscientist, wow, this is a very exciting area. And it's very badly needed, because I think ultimately everybody will feel a lot better about psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy if a lot of the unknowns just become more known.
Known unknowns. What was the turn of phrase there?
The
Unknown
unknown
knowns
knowns and the unknown knowns and the known unknowns.
Perfect.
Whatever that is. But it is a good phrase.
It's I read his autobiography and it was interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know why I read a lot of these scary folks, but it's helpful to know their minds a little bit. Anyway, yeah, that's really a big vision, Rachel. I'm endlessly excited about what we're going to learn over the next couple of years, especially as quantum computing and other big supercomputers come online. I think there's a lot left.
What's nice is that philanthropists and investors are pumping a lot of money into this space. And I think that the money should be used to gain knowledge, not just drug development, but also some of these other kinds of pieces of information that will ultimately accelerate drug development. But I think
Mm,
that eventually, and very soon, I think that some of the governmental funding agencies that are responsible for really funding neuroscience and mental health are going to start to participate and start to understand that a thorough knowledge of these approaches is going to accelerate clinical therapeutics. And again, circling back to the beginning, you don't want to leave people out of this club. You want to hear indigenous voices. You want to hear how these compounds have been used ceremonially. You want to be humble in understanding that you're not just going to invent the stuff that no one's ever heard of, that an aspect of what we do is reinvention of a wheel, but perhaps with a new technological spin. So we really do want to have a very, very big tent going forward. And that's certainly our intention with the Mount Sinai Center for Psychedelic Psychotherapy and Trauma Research. And
mm,
that is really the idea of just not making it a siloed ivory tower, but really a place where we can engage with everyone, including industry. I can't leave industry out either, but we want to just really have an expansive vision for healing and also social change.
mm. Yeah, agreed. Now, there was another point you brought up after our talk, which is around the perceived lack of willingness for the U.S. federal government to fund psychedelic research, and I think I've read you've received some, and you can speak to this. Is it is it just that it requires a lot of extra paperwork, as we were kind of talking about before, or what's going on there?
I think that some of the comments that I've made about government funding is for people to recognize that government is pretty transparent about the kinds of things that it will and won't fund. And that in order for anyone to get a successful grant application pushed through, they have to kind of understand what the government is looking for and what is likely to get a good peer review.
Hmm.
In mental health, it's been this way for several years. The NIMH, at least, is not very willing to fund clinical trials unless the person writing the application can demonstrate that the intervention has an identifiable target in the brain that the intervention is addressing. So, for example, let's say you think that disease X is a result of I don't know, let's call it low serotonin, right? And
Sure.
you have an intervention that is going to raise serotonin levels. So before you even get funding to do that project, you're going to have proof of concept that your intervention that low serotonin is definitely a problem that is causing the symptoms and that your intervention targets it, right? So a lot of
Hmm.
times the work is in too preliminary a stage to get the kind of a clinical trials grant that people are expecting. So if you have an idea of doing research in psychedelics, I can tell you that I haven't bumped into anyone that said to me, no, we don't fund psychedelic research, but you have to work with a project officer and you have to try to
Hmm.
figure out, well, which call for proposals might my project fit into? How can I develop the science that will also inform the mechanism of action of the trial? You know, in a recent trial that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, I believe that the original outcome for psilocybin was going to be how the effects on a brain scan, right? So
Hmm.
that kind of stuff is more likely to get funded than just a straight out clinical trial of a drug that has never been shown to have any effect in a pathophysiology of interest. So I think a lot of times we level a criticism against a governmental agency for not being willing to fund something when we haven't really kind of figured out what they will be willing to fund, or haven't had any of the internal conversations about how to create a study with psychedelics that is fundable because it fits into the areas of importance in the strategic plan of the funding agency. So again, no one's ever said to me, oh, we don't fund psychedelics. It's just a matter of going through the steps again, having the discussions with people. How could this work? How do we make it work? What are the details of what we would have to do? What kind of work might we need to have first before a clinical trial can be supported? So again, I'm speaking as someone who's been in this profession for 35 years and has gotten a lot of grants because you don't wake up one day and say, oh, I have a brilliant idea. Let me write the government, right?
Some people do.
I've never gotten a grant that way, I can tell you, but I have gotten many grants by having conversations with project officers and saying, well, I'm interested in PTSD. Tell me your understanding of what kind of work you think should be funded in the space. And here's what I think, and here's what you think. And how do we put these two ideas together? And more importantly, will you support my efforts if I go in this direction? Meaning, do you think it's a good idea? Will you help me, formulate a convincing project that will be successful in a peer review capacity? So again, academic science is a team sport in many regards. You have to assemble a team. You have to really figure out what's important. There's nobody that does not want new treatments for mental health to be developed. That's good. There's no one that doesn't want to learn more about the brain. So I think my prediction here today, it's 2021, is that within the next 3 years, you're going to see you're going to see the beginning of government funding for basic science research in psychedelics aimed at explaining why these might be viable therapeutic approaches, followed by clinical trials that will be conducted either in partnership with industry, which now you have to do because of the nature of the scheduling. And when the drugs are descheduled, then it'll open up a very different kind of world for doing the kind of research that would qualify for government funding. So again, I like to look at these things, it's not as sensationalized what I'm saying or as outrageous or sexy or provocative, but I think the truth is that there is a way to take drug development with psychedelics forward with our government partners. I think it has to be done in a certain way. And again, always with an eye towards safety and minimization of risk and maximizing objective scientific knowledge.
I love it. And do you have any would you have any predictions for maybe what this looks like 15 years out, this field as a whole, psychedelics for, in particular, kind of diagnosable psychiatric conditions?
Well, I'm hoping that we will graduate from treating psychiatric conditions to using these tools safely and therapeutically before they become treatment-resistant conditions. Like, for example, in the context of trauma, would it be possible to think about using a psychedelic experience as part of helping people in the early stages of processing something difficult before it turns into a chronic PTSD? If you know you're going to be in harm's way, would it be possible to one day in the future use a psychedelic experience to really understand a person's fears and trepidations and kind of issues about why they're choosing to go into harm's way, or if they're prepared to do so? Is there a way to really use these compounds responsibly and safely in a whole range of indications? I hope that we'll start seeing that. And I hope that we will be able to see for patients that have struggled for years and decades with mental illness. I hope that we will be able to use these approaches to accelerate their care and also think about how we can change our current community therapy settings to be hospitable to these kinds of approaches, and what other kind of supports we would need to really help people after they've had psychedelic experiences. What else do people need in order to integrate into society to develop better social structures? So I'm very hopeful, but I think the more sober and conservative we are at this stage, the higher the yield we will have in the future in terms of a very big footprint for these approaches, not just as last ditch. I've tried everything, so now let me try this approach, but as the tools that I think that people have known for years and decades and millennia, even in some societies, that they could be, if used correctly at the right time, in the right place, in the right way, in the right setting, the right people. So I have a lot of hopes, and I hope, to quote Stan Grof, that we don't blow it. Which is apparently what he said to Rick Doblin and Michael Midhofer when they were finally granted permission to embark on the very exciting phase 2 trials. So I do hope that works out as a vision. And I'm seeing a lot of excitement in my colleagues, and that instead of the initial comments of, I must be having a midlife crisis, a lot of people are asking, well, do I know something that would help you, and could we collaborate? And so it's very, very hopeful right now. These are very good times.
Yeah. People are so down on the corporate angles here. I see reasons for it once in a while, but realistically, MAPS took 25 years to get to now, and money's going to really accelerate this thing, and it's going to be really, really interesting what this looks like.
It's not just money. It's industry knows how to do drug development and and generate the kind of knowledge that the FDA requires. We're going to have to make our peace with this, and we can also develop standards for our industry partners. We could develop a wish list of what we would like to see in a responsible company. We could urge investors to reinvest some of their profits for social good, or for developing knowledge that might be needed that is harder to raise because it doesn't lead immediately to IP or a patent or the bottom line. I think that psychedelics make us feel more connected to one another and the earth, and we have to just remind people that there's an obligation, if you make a lot of money from psychedelics, to turn it back a little bit, just a little bit, so that we can help people that haven't been able to make that money benefit from these compounds. And I don't think it's going to be a hard sell, but I don't think that you make this argument effectively by demonizing people that are investing in the space. I don't see how that accomplishes much. And I think that when you want to engage someone in a partnership, you don't tell them how much you disrespect what they're doing. You tell them about all the things that they can bring to the table that you really, really want to benefit from, and what you can do, and the vision that you have for a better world. And so that is also in the true spirit of psychedelics. So I'd like to see these conversations for real. And I don't want to see people criticizing others, even if there is something to criticize, because I don't think that is necessarily the most productive route towards a renaissance, a revolution, and what we're trying to accomplish. I mean, and those conversations can be had maybe a little bit more privately and with less shrill voices. I don't know, but I think part of the critiques, if done respectively, will change the field for the better. But instead of just critiquing, paint the vision that you want to see. Tell me what your expectation is of investors, and how and what ideas you can give people that are really making a lot of money, or how they can be superheroes by taking some of that and really helping the broader mission. And I think that people will be responsive to this.
Amazing. All right. Well, anything else you might want to put in here before we wrap? I think we're about to close up.
No, I think people can follow me on Twitter and follow my center, MS Psychedelics, on Twitter. I do respond on Twitter and LinkedIn and other social media if you want to follow our work. And also feel free to reach out to me privately for any reason. If you have any questions about our trials, I will refer that email probably, but I definitely won't ignore it. And yeah, anyone interested in learning more about what we do and collaboration, delighted to hear from anyone out there.
Rachel Yehuda, I really appreciate you coming on, and I hope folks follow your work. You've done a lot, and I think you're going to continue to do quite a bit. And I just hope folks stay tuned.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for being here.
Thanks.
And there you have it, Rachel Yehuda of Mount Sinai. And I really hope you enjoyed this episode. It was fun for me. I hope Rachel enjoyed it as well. And I think that's it for now. So yeah, check out Rachel's work, follow her on socials. She's quite active on Twitter. And if you want to support us, check out Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists at psychedelicsa.com. I think you will find it endlessly interesting and very helpful in your journey trying to find your place in the psychedelic future. All right, thanks for tuning in, everybody. See you next time. Joe Moore signing off.